Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, it's been a while since we checked in and covered some content about the war between Russia and Ukraine. When the war first broke out, I covered a ton of context videos, and all that context holds true, so make sure to check those out. But there's more of a push in the last few days of trying to get this war ended. You probably heard about President Trump meeting Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Then just a few days later, President Trump met with Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, as well as the heads of states of a bunch of European nations. So if there is going to be an end soon, it seems like now it's the closest it probably has been. So I wanted to check in with Warfronts and see what's going on over here, because they did a video called "The War in Ukraine Could End Fast. Here's What to Know." So hopefully what'll be good here is to get sort of the context of the war itself and what potential negotiations could look like. I'm also interested to see some hypotheses about what's next. What's next for Ukraine? What's next for Russia? What's next for Europe? And maybe we can start to kind of unpack that now. Before we get to the video, I just launched my new original content channel. Right now it's called Mr. Terry Originals. And it's been years of the making of trying to develop the style that I would like original content to be. It's going to be fun. It'll be very entertaining for you, but still packed with historical information, but also some very thought-provoking stuff like our alternate history series. I'll link my new channel down below. Love to have you as a sub. All right, let's get started. All right, looks like the first frame is a very much zoomed in on Simon's beard here.
War in Ukraine could actually end. It's not exaggeration, it's not some optimistic fantasy.
Sometimes wars seem like they'll never end, though.
Then it could end up happening much sooner than anybody anticipated. A few days after what appeared to be an inconclusive summit in Alaska, Russia and Ukraine have both started to show that they're willing to make major compromises, the sort of compromises that both Putin and Zelensky need in order to agree to end the war.
You know what's been kind of frustrating? When you see, at least like the public footage of the conversations that happen, everyone both directly or indirectly involved says the same thing. We want an end to the war. We need to end the war. Let's talk about ending the war. But then very little ever gets brought up about what exactly the terms are going to be. And obviously that is the hang up. And that's where really things need to be talked about next.
Years of diplomatic paralysis, and without the fanfare or bravado that would suggest this is all smoke and mirrors, we seem to finally have a breakthrough in Eastern Europe, and one that could affect a ceasefire.
You know, one thing, did you guys see? I'm assuming President Trump ordered it, that when they were
all smoke and mirrors,
when they were meeting here on like basically the runway platform here in Alaska, there was the stealth bomber with some other jets, and there were like 5 of them, and they flew really, really low, which would have been deafening. If you've never heard jets or bombers before, I don't think you can appreciate how loud and powerful they are unless you've experienced it. It seemed like it was supposed to be like a intimidating flex. It was kind of funny, actually.
To finally have a breakthrough in Eastern Europe, and one that could affect a ceasefire practically out of nowhere. Now, if that happens, then the ceasefire won't be an easy one for Ukraine to accept by any stretch. But the terms that are within reach for Ukraine today are a hell of a lot better than the terms that Vladimir Putin's Russia has offered before. Right now, we need to prepare.
That's interesting. So would you think if the stuff is kinder than I guess what was going on before, is that indicative that, well, I guess one of two things: Russia is sick of this war and dying, or maybe, it's becoming unpopular or whatever, or the Ukrainians are putting up more of a defense than maybe they had thought to, especially this far into the conflict. Which one do you think is more the case? Because one thing we know about wars and how their ends get negotiated is it's all about who has the momentum at the time. Look at World War I, for example. At the time negotiations started, the Allies had sort of flipped the script on the war and had driven Germany back. They held the power, which means then that the terms of such treaty is going to favor much more so the people with that momentum than the people that don't. So where is the momentum exactly at in this conflict with Russia and Ukraine? It's always seemed to be with Russia, but has that changed?
For a breakthrough in the Ukraine war, to understand what's changed on both sides, explore what might be possible in a negotiation, and get our first look at what post-war Ukraine might actually be.
Okay, that's
Just
a great one.
Just into the video today, it's brought to you by Outskill. Who are Outskill? Well, they are the largest AI education company on the planet, which is, AI is becoming very important.
I know a lot of...
Recently, Microsoft said that they could
AI is designed for
36%
education
of their workforce through AI automation.
I'm always interested to hear about that stuff.
Because you think if you work at Microsoft, you've got to be really skilled. Amazon, JP Morgan, Ford are all cutting jobs, but why not change things? Instead of being replaced by AI, why not be someone who's leading the charge? And that's why I have partnered with Outskill to give you guys free access to their 2-day AI mastermind this weekend. Normally costs $895, but for you guys, my viewers, 1,000 free seats.
I just want to know what these
72 hours, 4 million people
AI companies is. What are you doing
now using
differently?
AI to earn more money, get those promotions, all of that good stuff. Your master prompt engineering, learn 10 powerful
And if it comes to
AI
education,
tools like
what's their role?
And Claude, build AI agents, automate your work, and create apps with AI, or even running your own business. This is for you. So mark your calendars. It's this Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. both days. Sign up now. You'll get $5,000 worth of bonuses, including a 3,000 plus prompt Bible. There is
your
a link in the description below.
Are you guys using AI
in the pinned comment. Grab your free seat before it expires.
I don't know, logistics or anything in your businesses you work for or own?
By AI, master it this very weekend. And now today's episode. Rapid developments. Okay, let's break the fourth wall, because here at Warfronts, our team was on call over the weekend in the event that a major breakthrough or a catastrophic failure came out of the Alaska summit between Trump and Putin. Depending on what happens, we are ready to turn around an episode for Saturday evening to explain either the triumph or the tragedy of whatever had gone down on the edge of the Arctic Circle. But in the hours after the summit ended, we and the entire global press were left with that dreary third option that every content creator dreads.
It just came to my mind. What if that meeting, and they agreed to do it in Alaska, ended up being just like something where Putin was like, hey, Alaska, we used to claim this. It's ours now. All of a sudden, the Russian military just shows up.
No real news in either direction. We were disappointed, but at least we had our weekend. With vague claims of progress, but zero details, zero outlines, and zero questions from the press, Trump and Putin left the summit and went their separate ways. At that moment, it luckily didn't seem as if the war's end was any further away than it had been before, but we
didn't get a lot, it seemed like, out of that, at least from the public sphere. I mean, again, there's always like the public version of this stuff, and then there's what's supposed to be happening behind closed doors. And they met, I mean, it was less than a day, right? It was basically like a few hours. And how much of that time was done behind closed doors, I would assume with, if it was Trump alone, but also with Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. But what specific details were discussed? Don't really know yet. What is Putin going to want? And how will the United States, even be a part of this, right? We know President Trump very much likes to be one that likes to be that like third party in international conflicts. We've seen it on multiple occasions, even this year. And say what you want about, how he loves the idea. It seems like of being, the one that is the reason they got peace. Like, he made the peace deal done. But there's been a lot of these, or at least parts of these conversations between places. Recently, I was talking about like India and Pakistan being part of that, and a few others that, of course, I've covered on the channel here recently.
Prospect of a peace deal didn't seem as if it had improved either. But over the weekend, a slow, steady drip of revelations began to flow outward from Alaska, with the first changes coming from Trump himself. According to sources within Washington, Trump's conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday night centered on one key change in Russia's position.
Did you all notice? Remember how, like, infamously one of those first meetings where Zelensky was coming over, to the White House, and like Trump and Vance were like mad at him for not, like dressing up. Zelensky usually dressed pretty modest. I think, I don't know if it's just like the idea of trying to look more like a regular person because his, country is at war. But I do feel like in this next meeting that worked because it's a little bit classier. He's not just wearing like the tight, like almost like turtleneck, like tactical shirt, but now he's got kind of a, like a nice jacket, and he's got his button up like black shirt. It's pretty good looking, but I feel like Zelensky did take that seriously. He's like, all right, I guess they care about that kind of stuff. I'm gonna dress up.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky
usually looks like
night,
that,
centered on one key change in Russia's position. Whereas Putin had been stating consistently before the summit began that he and Russia would insist on complete control of the 4 Ukrainian oblasts or regions that Russia claims to have annexed, his ambitions in that...
The historical context, again, if you didn't see some of the videos of that, Ukraine has regions that have more pro kind of Russian connections, or at least will support Ukrainian leaders and vote for ones they want more of a positive or more normalized relationship with Russia. And those are largely in these regions that they're showing right here, this like eastern part of Ukraine. So if these are indeed fully under control of basically the Russian military, an annexation of these territories that again have had more of the pro-Russian sentiments across the country seem to be the thing that will be required here. It also seems too that Crimea, although it was taken over and annexed back in 2014 and had referendums for voters basically to join Russia, has not necessarily been publicly acknowledged as like Russian territory by the international community. That does at least seems to also be part of the tactics that Putin will want for like even from again, countries like the United States. Will that be like a formal recognition of Crimea as Russian territory?
4 Ukrainian oblasts or regions that Russia claims to have annexed, his ambitions in that regard appear to be more limited in private conversation. During the summit, Putin had expressed that if Kiev ceded territorial control of Donetsk Oblast, already mostly under the control of Russian forces, as well as accepting Russian control over Luhansk Oblast, which Russian forces already control, then Russia would consent to a freeze of the front lines across the rest of Ukraine.
That seemed like even at the beginning that would be kind of the goal. If it's to take like all of Ukraine, that becomes obviously a much harder task and one that's harder to justify, even with the deep history of literally tying Kiev to Russian history and the ancient history. You've probably heard that mentioned numerous times in Putin interviews is his kind of nationalistic arguments about, the modern Russia and its origins that actually come kind of through Kiev and the Kievan Rus. But from the Ukrainian perspective, giving up those regions is also giving up about a fifth, about 20% of your entire country. These are massive cities that, of course, have plenty of people in there that are not going to be like pro annexation by Russia. So is it at this point that this is going to be considered what type of level of disaster for Ukraine if it's that 20% losing that is this completely unacceptable failure, or some kind of inevitable loss that maybe saves some face and saves lives, afterwards? I think that's where there's going to be a big debate after this, is the internal politics about Ukraine. Hopefully we get to more of those conversations, because I have some more things I think that we ought to think about when hypothesizing about what's going to happen in Ukraine afterwards.
Russia, as limited as it might sound, that is a fairly major concession, and one that demonstrated a potential willingness to accept a far more neutral set of ceasefire terms than the terms it had previously advocated. Of course, a peace in Ukraine will take compromise from both sides, and according to the weekend's news, Zelensky had rejected that offer when Trump first explained it. But in a surprising turn of events from Kiev, it took less than 48 hours for Zelensky to change his tune. Now, much like Putin has been demanding full control of 4 of Ukraine's oblasts before the summit, not just Donetsk and Luhansk, but Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, Zelensky has kept a similarly hardline position in the opposite direction. According to Zelensky, Ukraine intends to seek a full return of all territory occupied by Russia, including all 4 oblasts in question and the Isthmus of Crimea, annexed and occupied by Russia back in 2014.
Okay, so understand that in negotiations, I don't care if it's something as serious as this, or something like buying a car, the salesman at the car dealership and you, if you're doing this the smart way when it comes to negotiations, are going to open up, that dollar value at the extreme side of what you are, willing to make a deal for. You don't start with the lowball offer. So in this kind of scenario for Zelensky, is this truly what is a red line thing that all of these territories must be returned, including the Crimea that was gone 10 years before this? Or is that a way to show that when you do actually agree to a deal that doesn't include all those things, that it shows you as a charitable negotiator that is trying to negotiate in good faith? I'm not sure if we know yet until a deal actually makes or if it's officially rejected, I guess.
In fact, much to Donald Trump's chagrin, Zelensky has been arguing that because the Ukrainian constitution does not grant him the right to give away the nation's territory, any idea of a land swap is fundamentally impossible. But when Zelensky gave a press conference this Sunday in the city of Brussels, ahead of his meeting with Trump in Washington yesterday, he changed his tune on the question for the very first time.
Nothing's impossible in warfare. Things that are written down on papers are only enforced by those that can actually enforce those things. So, is it impossible for these things to be seceded? Well, no. I mean, unfortunately, it seems like in conflicts like this, the thing that comes out of it is justifying the might is right idea. That because you can annex something, that you're justified in doing it. Which, of course, is a scary precedent to set, but in a cynical way has been really how history has gone.
In Washington yesterday, he changed his tune on the question for the very first time. Said Zelensky of the prospect of a land swap, quoting here, "We need real negotiations, which means we can start where the front line is now." Zelensky expressed that his position came with the support of allied leaders in Europe. Also on Sunday, Trump's primary negotiating envoy, Steve Witkoff, told CNN that Putin had made another major concession at the Alaska meeting.
What?
According to Witkoff, Putin had agreed that the United States and the nations of Europe could offer Ukraine a security guarantee, basically pledging that the US and Europe would defend Ukraine's sovereignty against any further invasion by Russia.
Now, historical context also important here. We had something similar, I guess, to this. When the early to mid 90s, Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that they had going back from the Cold War Soviet Union era. And although the Ukrainians couldn't, at least at that time, access the actual use and I believe the launch systems, because those were actually held back in the Soviet Union proper, but that giving them up would require assurances of security basically by the West, including the United States. Budapest Memorandum, if you want to look into it. But in its vague nature, we also saw it play out in this invasion, where you have this invasion. And of course, I guess, depending on the interpretation of the agreements made then, that you would have support from someone like the United States. Now, I don't remember, and looking into that agreement close enough, if that actually included direct, boots on the ground intervention that we didn't actually see in this. What we saw was the sale of some war materials, and some of it being stuff that really was surplus and out of use things that ended up going there. But of course, military contractors, love this stuff. They make a lot of money and sell that stuff there. But I guess it comes down to, will Ukraine trust an agreement for support, for assurances by both Russia, which happened before when they gave up their nukes too, that they would not, be invaded or anything, and that they would actually get support from the West? Or are they going to look back and say that these type of agreements are not trustworthy, therefore we can't really accept them as the thing that, we, I guess, as Ukraine, get out of this conflict? What do you guys think about that? Should Ukraine trust this type of agreement? But then again, do they have a choice not to?
On its face, that might sound like a claim that Trump himself contradicted the following day when, on Monday, Trump told Ukraine over social media to accept that for the foreseeable future, Ukraine had no hope of joining NATO. But what Witkoff is describing and what Vladimir Putin's supposedly agreed to isn't that Ukraine would join NATO, it's that Ukraine would get a major benefit that is generally tied to NATO membership.
And that's kind of been the, I guess, has been implied as well, is that Ukraine, which is probably, historically tied itself more to Russian history, whether it's the empire or whether it's the Soviet Union, closer to than a lot of the other independent states that came off of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Ukraine would never join NATO. Now, what ended up happening, and basically all these European independent states that came off the Soviet Union, was that they did join NATO. And in fact, even with the, this invasion, you also saw the rapid process to allow Finland, a bordering state, as well as Sweden, who were not NATO nations. So I guess in that sense, if what Russia, I guess, gets out of it is, okay, if Ukraine somehow and NATO continually pledge that Ukraine will not be added, was the trade-off worth that now kind of indirectly in this, Finland and Sweden now joining it? Is that like a net gain? Is it a net negative, I guess, for the Russians?
A collective security agreement with the benefit that is generally tied to NATO membership. A collective security agreement with the United States and Europe that Ukraine can use as a guarantor of its sovereignty in the years to come. While that offer is a surprise coming from Putin, it's important because it inherently offers Putin a win of his own, namely the ability to go back to Russia and claim victory because it's kept Ukraine out of NATO. Not only that, but the offer would likely allow European troops to deploy to Ukraine as part of a coalition of the willing, a presence on Russia's border that Putin has seemed to suggest that he could live with.
Do you guys think that Ukraine was destined to join NATO before this war took place, before this invasion took place? This seems to have been one of the things maybe promoted, maybe by the Russian state to justify some of this. But we also know the deeper cultural ties that Putin has repeatedly talked about the importance of Ukraine to Russia. What do you think about that? Were they destined to become part of NATO?
Quoting Witkoff, we agreed to robust security guarantees that I would describe as game-changing.
It's going to have to be very specific, much more than
Zelensky and leaders from NATO and several European nations joined Donald Trump at the White House for their own summit, and again, all parties indicated that a push toward peace was a real possibility.
That was. I know it's the public part, but what was kind of frustrating about this was that whole table, and you had like leaders from France and Germany, etc., and that's all they said is just like peace. Okay, we need to have peace. We have to have peace. And it's like, okay, what are the next steps to that? What, right? Yes, everyone seems to agree that, but hasn't that already been established? So we'll see what comes out in the next few days, though, because the meetings that are not going to be publicly televised is where, those details are actually going to be debated, because they're not going to want to debate those in the public. They want to keep those behind shut doors.
Despite a wave of Russian attacks against Ukrainian population centers that day, Ukraine and its European allies agreed to engage Russia in direct negotiations as soon as possible. Details from the meeting behind closed doors haven't leaked out as of the time of writing, but a chorus of public statements from Zelensky and his European partners all indicated, at least for the global press, that things were headed in the right direction. As NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte told the press, quote, "If we play this well, we could end this. And we have to end it."
Now, another thing we're going to have to consider, too, is Zelensky and the Ukrainian states going to be, I guess, okay with these other European nations almost like negotiating on behalf of Ukraine, right? Are they going to feel that they are going to be sort of silenced in this discussion and decisions are basically going to be made for them? Or again, it comes back to this thought we got to circle back and all this stuff. Does it matter if Ukraine thinks this or not? We know how much Ukraine has relied on European support for, fighting this conflict. And if a deal comes out, whether Ukraine agrees to it or not, that ends up, leading to these munitions and all the products that are going to be used for fighting. If those get pulled out, and taken away from Ukraine, that Zelensky and Ukraine are, going to have their hands tied in this situation.
Just before we continue today, real quick plug, make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter for the absolute most breakingest of breaking news that we can't get videos out quickly enough on. It goes out twice per week, and it's completely free.
What does Ground News say about the leadings, I guess, of the framing of their newsletter? Potential for compromise?
At this point in today's episode, we got to be real clear. Right now, all we're observing are a series of changes in rhetoric, some coming from the involved parties themselves, and some described secondhand by other international actors. Ukraine and Russia are each publicly sticking to many of their prior hardline positions, even while seeming to contradict those positions in real time. But in a negotiation to end a years-long war, hardline positions that reiterate each side's unwillingness to compromise, quite frankly, those are cheap and easy statements to make with no real consequences other than a continuation of the status quo. Statements of potential compromise, however, are not nearly so easy to abandon, and until the last several days, both sides have been very disciplined about avoiding anything that might even hint at a willingness to back off some of their claims.
Well, and again, like we said a few minutes ago, that's really how negotiation tactics work in almost anything. You don't want to appear that you are willing to compromise, because that's the starting point. You want to be in a position of strength. But you eventually will find out if someone's bluffing or not.
Russia and Ukraine, both to be changing that now, is an important shift on its own, even before it's followed by action. Now, putting aside the rhetoric from both sides, the reality of the situation in Ukraine is that in any peace deal, Ukraine would probably have to make some major sacrifices. Russia sits on roughly a fifth of Ukraine's territory, and for Russia to agree to give that territory back without facing any overwhelming threat that would lead Putin to raise the white flag has always been an unrealistic outcome.
Just to, I guess, start to get to hypothesizing a little bit. I don't think there's any way that Russia would agree to vacate all of these places, even if it meant some kind of like more official assurance that Ukraine will not, join NATO. But also Russia has been very critical of the Ukrainian government suppressing more pro-Russia sentiment from their population and from their politicians, basically saying that, like pro-Russian or Russian Ukrainians are being oppressed in the state. If you know about some of the elections that have happened, over a decade ago, that there has been a lot of drama in a lot of their elections between, presidents that have more of a pro stance with their relations to Russia and those that don't. And there ends up being, accusations of a lot of like election fraud and those sort of things. That's something that Russia has stated is of grave concern, in Ukraine. Probably also heard of this idea of like the denazification of Ukraine, which has often, I think, been combined with their accusations of, pro fraud, voter suppression, and just opinion suppression. That if that is happening, that oppression is happening towards more pro-Russian Ukrainians, that basically aligns itself with, Nazism, which is such a word that is just universally, agreed upon as bad. And when you start to tag those things, they become very like emotionally charged. And it's a great way to show people in a negative light.
So too would a peace deal probably have required Putin to relinquish at least some of his territorial claims in Ukraine. Just like Russia, Ukraine's position isn't nearly so terrible right now that the nation would be forced into agreeing to give back a huge chunk of land. But for both Putin and Zelensky to admit that they're willing to accept less than ideal territorial conditions at basically the same time, that's a massive change. More importantly, the terms they each endorsed would suggest that there's room to achieve a genuine compromise. If we take him at his word, Zelensky would go into a series of peace negotiations, starting with the boundaries of the current front line, meaning by default, the condition he and Ukraine would consent to would be for the front lines to freeze. If we take Putin's word as what's been reported by sources in Washington, then his default condition is also a frozen front line, except for Donetsk Oblast, which Russia would control fully. Russia would also control Luhansk Oblast fully.
Is that, I have to look again. I remember looking at this a lot more. The oblasts are kind of like these provinces or states. Which one of these oblasts in eastern Ukraine have the most like pro-Russian connections? Because I wonder if that's going to be factored in which of these, oblasts in the agreements are going to be agreed to now be controlled by Russia or remain in, Ukrainian control. Let me know below on that one. I don't want to say with conviction which ones are which.
But that's already the case, and even though Zelensky has provisionally rejected Russia's proposal, that stance seems already to be changing, and if Russia is willing to bargain for control over Donetsk Oblast, then it could make a series of meaningful offers to Ukraine in return. Russia controls a chunk of border territory near the city of Sumy, where Ukrainian leaders reported yesterday that Russian forces have been defeated and deterred from their attempt to actually take the city itself. Russia also holds a narrow
important for Ukrainian
Kharkiv Oblast, and speaking of Kharkiv, Russia also controls the zone along the regional border with Luhansk. If Russia were willing to give each of those three zones back to Ukraine, it may allow Ukraine to accept Russian control over Donetsk in its entirety, especially when that territory swap is paired with non-territorial concessions that Russia might be willing to make.
Yeah. It makes sense just if you really look at just the reality of the situations and which are under control and, which are still yet to be determined, I guess.
Speaking of non-territorial concessions, the question of Ukraine's NATO membership is one that we've got to break apart into two components.
It's going to be on the table.
Ukraine's desire to have a NATO-style security guarantee from the West versus Ukraine's desire to be a formal, proper part of the organization known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. If Ukraine wants the latter, if it wants to explicitly be a part of NATO, then Putin's apparent offer to accept a NATO-style security guarantee would be a non-starter. But if,
you think so? Meaning that there's like that is mandatory for any discussions. Do you think that'll be the case, the NATO membership? How much does Putin and Russia take seriously, Ukraine's NATO membership? If you want to compare it to the membership of, say, like the Baltic states and stuff like that, what context is there for them to fear a Ukrainian NATO membership? And what is that fear? Is it that there will be maybe some like a future invasion, I guess, of Ukraine backed by NATO, of maybe trying to retake some of those, oblasts that were once a part of Ukrainian control? Would it be the fear of Ukraine going into the Russian territory that, already existed before that? And are those like legitimate fears? That'd be something else, I guess, to ask when trying to think of these perspectives that are coming to the negotiation table. What do you think?
The thing that Ukraine needs most is a security guarantee,
right.
And a lack of formal NATO membership might not mean very much in practice. If Putin's ultimate objective is to save face and essentially claim victory on a technicality, then there is no reason why Ukraine wouldn't be able to hammer out an extensive deal with NATO member nations, building on the arms agreements, the interoperability principles, and the diplomatic relationships that Ukraine already has with those nations. In fact, once those deals were in place, it might not even cost Ukraine very much to formally suspend or withdraw its bid for NATO membership. This would allow Russian state media to crow about Ukraine's capitulation, while never mentioning that Ukraine's actually got most of what it wanted.
Do you think there's any way that this could end in like a Korean War situation where there actually is no like formal treaty to end it, but basically just like de facto borders are going to be established with continual military posturing just for decades and decades and, decades, when even though there's not a treaty, it still just seems like in reality, borders have been established, and those areas that should still technically, I guess, be up for consideration about who controls them are still controlled, by one of these countries. Do you think that is the potential, just the infinite armistice kind of thing?
At the end of the day, while never mentioning that Ukraine's actually got most of what it wanted. If, at the end of the day, Putin would stand by as Ukraine seals a deal with the West that's separate from NATO but grants all the same protections as NATO membership would, then certainly that's a tedious request for Ukraine to have to accommodate. But 3.5 years of war have also been quite tedious, and for Ukraine, some headaches of paperwork might be a price worth paying. There are, of course, still some outstanding issues that don't yet seem as if they've been accounted for.
But hundreds of thousands dead.
Talks in Washington, French President
Emmanuel
Macron
yet?
expressed Ukraine's need for a strong army of its own in a post-war Europe in reference to the likelihood of Russia attempting to impose constraints on Ukraine's future military.
That is where we could start talking a bit about what's going to be the effect going forward on these other countries. Are you going to see an increase in military spending from other countries? I mean, France, pretty far away from Russia. There's no imminent threat of Russia, invading France. But these other countries, again, like a Poland, Finland, etc. Some of these countries already have mandatory military training. Like Finland has that. Every male has to, do military service and military training. But do you think that's going to be one of the effects of this? And I'm not talking about Ukraine, which will have, a motivation if they can actually do this in trying to militarily grow itself for future conflicts with Russia. But what do you think about some of these other countries? Again, France makes sense for someone like Poland, Germany. What are they going to do after this?
Putin's apparent openness to European deployments in Ukraine would suggest that Ukraine's rearmament might be an area of compromise. It could also be an attempt by Putin to force Ukraine to downsize its military and accept European protection instead, possibly in hopes that Russia could then divide Kiev from its European allies in the future. And most important of all, judging by the recent rhetoric from Ukraine, is Kiev's insistence that Russia agree to a temporary ceasefire before peace negotiations begin. That is a stance that Russia has refused to agree to, and a couple of days ago, it was a stance that Trump openly dismissed. As of Monday's negotiations, this ceasefire before negotiations position remains a divisive issue, with Ukraine and its European partners holding firm to the idea that a ceasefire should come into effect before any further peace negotiations, with Trump again dismissing a ceasefire as an unnecessary prerequisite for talks to end the war. But with all nations now in agreement...
Yeah, that's one thing, too, that you might see is is, does there need to be an armistice before the direct discussions, happen? Sometimes they don't, sides don't agree to that sort of thing because it's in the best interest of a country that you are in the best possible negotiating position. So you often see, and you saw this even in World War I, that even though they had agreed when the armistice would begin, you'd think maybe in some way that at that moment, once you hear that an armistice is planned, for like noon tomorrow, but you still will see orders of fighting literally to like the last second. Yeah, like you saw that in World War I, and of course it pissed off so many soldiers. Are like, why are we doing this? We already agreed to an armistice. Okay, it doesn't go in effect till next time, but why are we fighting? What are we hoping to to do here? You don't want to die if you're a soldier when you've heard that peace is at hand. But again, it comes back to the idea of trying to be in the strongest position possible at the last moment possible.
That it's time for a three-way meeting that would bring Putin and Zelensky face to face. The question of a ceasefire may be put aside
because they've never met,
the
right?
Opportunity for a peace summit before it can vanish again in the near future. Just as important, the situation on the Ukrainian battlefield today isn't the same as it was when this summit was about to begin. Last week, Russia was making headlines after its forces pushed past the front lines near the embattled town of Pokrovsk in what seemed to be a major change of battlefield momentum. Now, however, elite Ukrainian units appear to have taken charge and neutralized that Russian threat, while in the north, Ukraine claims that the Russian advance near Sumy has been blunted as well. Under those conditions,
it does make sense why you're seeing maybe some Ukrainian success at this time, because they do have to push hard to be at the negotiating table. Oh, that statue goes so hard.
With less battlefield momentum and a looming Ukrainian winter, Russia may be more open to the idea of a temporary pause, or in practice, the Ukrainian military might not feel as strongly about insisting that a pause takes effect. A temporary ceasefire would save many lives on both sides and should absolutely be a consideration, but if it doesn't happen, then the implications for Ukraine aren't so dire anymore. Of course, we should be very clear that there's a strong possibility that Putin is just baiting the US and Ukraine, leading on its Western adversaries in order to buy time or work through some larger plan that Putin believes will grant him an advantage. Or if they do begin, peace talks could just stall and collapse, or any number of Russia's apparent concessions could turn out to be part of a convoluted plan to benefit Russia.
The Korea scenario.
That would mirror Russia's prior conduct in advance of its full-scale Ukraine invasion in 2022. Certainly, if this apparent movement toward peace can continue, then we'll be back here to discuss these potential pitfalls. And if you're interested in a longer episode in the future depicting all the ways that Putin could use these concessions to stab Ukraine in the back, then let us know in the comments.
Because that's what already a discussion that, again, Ukrainians are having, going back to the context of their negotiations and giving up nukes back in the 90s, that they believe that there would be assurances against a Russian invasion and to actually get help for that. And I still just wonder how that's going to play a role in these new guarantees. Will there be any kind of confidence in these type of agreements from the Ukrainian perspective?
But even still, the movement of the last couple of days represents a shift unlike what we've seen previously in this conflict, with both sides finally admitting a willingness to make concessions, and with the outline of each side's potential concessions actually showing an encouraging amount of overlap. No matter what happens next, that's a major shift for Ukraine and Russia alike. So how could Ukraine look if in a few months' time it turns out that these early signs of compromise resulted in genuine peace?
I have an alternate scenario that I actually brought this in and was thinking about it more when this war started. And it's mostly based on the premise that Ukraine doesn't, make like a deal, I guess, at the point that they have now, where they can still, control most of their territory. So this alternate scenario is far less likely at this point. But I do want to kind of propose, it's not even something I think would necessarily happen, but wondering if it's a possibility. And I want to see what theirs is, but stick around because I think I'd actually really like to get your feedback on this thought I have.
Well, quite likely, Ukraine would have to concede both Donetsk and Luhansk, giving up hard-fought territory near Pokrovsk that Ukraine has defended for over a year.
I do have a question about this. Millions have been displaced in Ukraine. What about right to return? If there are these, these people, again, especially ones that might be not on the, pro like Russian side of these regions, are they going to be welcomed back in these territories? Are they going to be seen as, I don't know, I guess dissidents and problematic for these territories that are now going to be under Russian control? So what happens to the millions of displaced, and again, those that wish to return back to their homes in these cities that are now Russian controlled? What about those that aren't going to want to return? What's going to happen to them? Where are they going to live? Just in the rest of Ukraine? Many have left the country. A ton went to Poland, for example. Some came to the United States. I had a girl last year that was a refugee from Eastern Ukraine. Her dad was still fighting over there, but her and her mom and her family, they went to Poland. And she was a high school student, and she did not like it in Poland. She said that there was like a lot of bullying and stuff by like other Polish teenagers because, you know, she was trying to keep up her school and go into school, and that she didn't like being there. She didn't feel safe or welcome there. And then she, you know, had met a family that knew somebody where I live in the US and helped like facilitate that. So she then came over to the US, and again, she wanted to, you know, go to school. She spoke almost zero English. I mean, literally, she came to my class in, you know, like the middle of the year and like pulled up her phone, and she was using a translating app saying, "Hey, I'm Ukrainian. I have joined your class." Stuff. She was an amazing girl, sweet girl, and super wanting to learn. So I would message her back and forth using, you know, these translation apps, and I got, you know, her story, and it was so tragic about how, you know, her father, you know, she it's hard to find time to talk to him and never know if he's dead, but I guess he was still fighting. And I remember asking her about, you know, what do you want to return? And she, you know, again, through translating the app was like, I don't think it's impossible because my home is destroyed. She said it was heartbreaking to hear. She said, I have no home to return to. So it seemed like she was already thinking about, you know, I guess, I don't know, some kind of permanent future, I guess, in the United States, but that's very difficult for a teenager, doesn't know the language, doesn't really know a lot of people. I mean, she found some family to move in, but those are the type of stories of people that I wonder what, you know, their future is going to be that were once living in those areas.
Giving up hard-fought territory near Pokrovsk that Ukraine has defended for over a year. Ukraine would be forced to rework its eastern lines of defense, adjusting to accommodate the loss of important logistical nodes and defensive constructions. In return, Russian occupations in Sumy and Kharkiv could go away, perhaps with a thin no-man's land dividing Kharkiv from Donetsk and Luhansk, or perhaps with Ukraine-controlled and Russia-controlled lands meeting directly. In Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, the front lines would freeze or possibly adjust slightly in some places so that Ukrainian and Russian territory can sit on opposite sides of the Dnieper River. Moving forwards, international maps might refer to Russia's new holdings as occupied Ukrainian territory or as part of the Russian Federation, with the Crimean Isthmus likely to follow suit. Ukraine could accept forward deployments of thousands of European troops backed up by air support and naval reinforcement on the Black Sea, while hammering out a NATO-esque deal to ensure that future Russian aggression is met with a unified response. Perhaps that version of an Eastern Europe is a version that could remain at peace, but the only answer to that question will come with time. Thank you for watching.
By the way, I see their kind of recommended video here before we kind of end here. If the Ukraine war ends, what happens next? That actually brings me to this scenario I was interested in getting some feedback on. But let me know if you want me to, you know, check this one out with you. Okay, so listen to this. So when this war began, you know, I got to thinking about historical context like I do about what would a Ukraine look like in the aftermath of Russian military devastation across like the whole country, whether or not they get like fully annexed as a country, but maybe even they don't. But the warfare is to a scale that, you know, when no part of Ukraine is safe, and there's been so much destruction of cities and the loss of life that would affect what Ukraine would be like, you know, at that time. And it came into my mind because when this kind of started also was when you saw also like the United States leaving Afghanistan after that, you know, 20-year conflict essentially. And I thought of Afghanistan as a context to consider, and this would actually be something that would go back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And here's the scenario. When Afghanistan was, you know, invaded by the Soviet Union, just like in Ukraine, you're going to have millions of refugees. You're going to have people that have families to protect. Again, young children, wives, those kind of that kind of thing, and they leave the country, for safety. They're not ones that may be like, I am going to stay and fight regardless of my like family situation, or if I die and leave behind my family, whatever it is. Normal people, right? This happened in Afghanistan, where a lot of those people they left the country. Which now then means that those that are fighting, like if you're fighting the Soviet Union or you're even fighting the United States in this situation in Afghanistan, who are the people now fighting? And who are the people that are in control of this situation? Is it just the everyday ordinary people? That's often not the case. A lot of those people that are going to stay behind and fight this stuff are some of the most nationalistic people in the country. They may have other type of philosophical, or even in Afghanistan situation, a lot of religious conviction and fundamentalism that brought them to, be okay with going toe to toe with like a world power. Now, if the sort of everyday people sort of leave, like what happened in, say, like in Afghanistan, and the war ends, and let's say maybe you won the war, like what happened with the Soviet Union, and they leave, or the United States forces leaving, who is then left at that time to rebuild the country? Now, you saw with like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, this is going to lead and you'll create something like the Taliban, a group with fundamentalist positions that became kind of the backbone of much of their will to fight. But what you might see is those people as extremists are now in charge of the country. So what happens to that country afterwards? They could take on the face of those fundamental beliefs, ultranationalism, extremism, whatever you want to call that. And that's what, happens with Afghanistan. So it got me thinking when this war, this invasion, started with Ukraine, could that have been the situation of Ukraine? Could Ukraine end up being another Afghanistan? In multiple senses, in the fact of what happened to Russia, in Afghanistan, which was so destructive for the Soviet Union, that is one of the elements that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union was their failure there. So that's one scenario that could have happened with, Russia, is maybe the Ukrainians did so well, but the Russians put in so much effort that it ends up becoming long-term, destructive as a force for Russia. Biggest difference, though, being is that the Soviet Union was already on very, very unstable ground, even through the 1980s as this was progressing. But let's just say in this scenario, the Russians did an incredible amount of devastation and they left, and Russia can get on sort of with their lives and with their state. What would that then mean for a destroyed and a Ukraine in rubble? You might have heard about some of the, incredibly nationalistic people that stayed behind, of course. And a lot of them have been criticized with basically being like some kind of Ukrainian version of, fascists or whatever, but might be seen as, political extremists when compared to just the general body of Ukraine. So if those are the people that basically took control of the country at the time, would they then be in control again of the sort of recreation of Ukraine, or then Ukraine becomes, I don't know, some kind of either just completely unstable and unable to build itself, or is it able to rebuild itself and become this ultra nationalists, new country that's really going to build itself on, I don't know, some kind of Ukrainian supremacy, and not just like an anti-Russian sentiment, but could some kind of like fundamentalist regime, whatever that would look like in a Ukrainian version, could that be like the future of Ukraine? And that was again in the scenario that this war would be even more devastating than it was, that it would just like kind of leave Ukraine sort of in rubble, like what happened with Afghanistan. So the scenario of that happening, I don't think is the future at all for Ukraine anymore, specifically because of the success that Ukraine has had at, they losing like 20% of their territory, but many parts of Ukraine being unaffected, at least by like direct, bombings and invasions and stuff like that. Ukraine not reaching the level that say like an Afghanistan did. But what do you think about that scenario, that the worst case scenario of Ukraine could have been like an Afghanistan, that Ukraine could turn into like a European Afghanistan? What do you think about that? Let me know down below. Thanks for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time. Bye.